Bloody hell are you? Thank you. My name is Alan Madden, Gadigal Elder. First song? Nah. Married man. 10 children, 26 grandchildren, and 17 great-great. Yes, we did have TV. Just couldn't afford the bloody electricity. Minister, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's always an honour and pleasure for me to welcome one and all the country. Just to give you a little bit of an insight of where you are and who we are. As we've all welcomed the countries, firstly, I'd like to acknowledge our First Nations and traditional owners of the lands that you may have come from or work upon, and pay my respects to all our Aboriginal elders, all elders, past and present, also pay my respects. To all our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters, from whatever Aboriginal or island nation you may have come from, welcome to Gadigal. And to all our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters here today, a very warm and sincere welcome to you to Gadigal. No matter where you've come from, whether it be across the seas, across the state or across town, once again, a very warm and sincere welcome to you to Gadigal. And as I've mentioned many times before, was, is and always will be Aboriginal land. Only three things shorter than that: coming, taxation and going. It's an honour and pleasure to be here today to welcome one and all to Gadigal. Gadigal is one of 29 clans of the Eora Nation. The Eora Nation is bounded by nature's own, the Hawkesbury River to the north, the Nepean to the west, and Georges River to the south. And in between those three mighty rivers is the Eora Nation. And in that nation, there are 29 clans. And the clan's land we're on today is Gadigal. On behalf of members of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council and of the Gadigal mob, once again, a very warm and sincere welcome to you to Gadigal. There's an old Aboriginal saying out there, and I think it's very appropriate for you mob here today. They say, where there's a will, there's relatives. And as you travel across these traditional lands and waters, may the spirits of our ancestors guide, look over you and keep you safe. So once again, on behalf of the Land Council and of the Gadigal mob, welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Uncle Alan, for that welcome to country. It is always hard to follow, but welcome to all to the inaugural Raisina at Sydney. I'm Justin Bassey, the Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge a number of dignitaries here today. Our two keynote speakers, India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, and Australia's Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Chris Bowen, Indian High Commissioner Manpreet Vohra, French Ambassador Jean-Pierre Thibault, other diplomats including the Deputy Heads of Mission of Indonesia, Japan and India, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade Secretary Jan Adams, and to her team, thank you very much for your support. Former Secretary Peter Varghese, other senior Indian Ministry of External Affairs officials, and of course senior Australian government officials. The first Raisina in Australia demonstrates how far the relationship between our two countries has come in recent years. Not only does it bring together our two leading think tanks, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and the Observer Research Foundation, it also signals the extent to which Australia and India increasingly stand for many of the same ideals: a free and open region, economic prosperity, and a rules-based order. Australia and India have recognised that our strategic interests are converging, but we've also recognised that an alignment of interest doesn't by itself make closer cooperation inevitable. Rather, it has taken a determined effort to strengthen our partnerships across economic, foreign and defence policy by grasping shared opportunities and meeting challenges together. Many people in this room have contributed to that effort, and no one has done more than Dr. Jaishankar himself. We've seen the bilateral relationship prosper, and we've seen the Quad re-emerge, reaching Foreign Minister level in 2019 and then leader level in 2021. The Quad leaders meeting to be held in Australia this year will continue to reinforce the significance of the relationship for each of our countries and our entire region. Today's event is a curtain raiser for the Raisina Dialogue, which will be held next month in Delhi. Having commenced in 2016, Raisina has quickly become the region's premier conference on geopolitics and geoeconomics, so it is with pride that we've brought it to Australia. It is also a prelude to ASPI's Sydney Dialogue, which, while a little more youthful than Raisina, is building a reputation as the foremost international forum on critical and emerging technologies. While the phrase think tanks conveys an image of deep thoughts of abstract theory, ASPI and ORF coming together for Raisina at Sydney shows that think tanks like ours are increasingly aware that thinking without doing and idealism without pragmatism is ineffective in our era of intense competition. It reflects that our regional and global challenges require not just theory, but strategy that can be practically implemented. At ASPI, we have proudly established an India program with critical support from DFAT and others, with the key being practical engagement with India at government, industry and civil society levels to further strengthen our ties. With India as G20 president this year, it is vital to both our nations' interests that we work together to advance a region where countries are sovereign and resilient, with a strategic balance that deters aggression and coercion and encourages cooperation. The Australia-India relationship shows that differences can be managed through dialogue, that hesitations of history can be overcome if there is sufficient trust between our political systems, and that practical cooperation can deliver real benefits to our nations and our region. Intimate dialogue, increased trust, and practical collaboration sums up the India-Australia partnership today. The long-standing view of Australia as a middle power and India as a developing one has transitioned into Australia as a regional power and India as the next superpower, with particular potential in advanced technologies that will be vital both for strategic balance and global influence. Whether we are responding to global events like the COVID-19 pandemic, working together on climate and energy security policies, identifying ways to enhance our economic security, protecting ourselves from national security implications of critical technologies, or countering interference in our democratic institutions and sovereignty, the Australia-India relationship is now more important than ever for ourselves and the region. Raisina at Sydney is a forum to tackle all of these challenges and to discuss how we can substantively respond as part of the next chapter in this increasingly entwined and aligned relationship. I thank Minister Jaishankar for working with ORF and ASPI and having the ambition to make this special event happen. I also thank the Australian Government for its support, and specifically Minister Bowen, whose participation shows the breadth of the bilateral relationship across the spectrum of international and national security issues, including climate and energy. And speaking of energy, I am grateful to Dr. Samir Saran and in awe of his indefatigable character. And I thank all of you for coming to turbocharge the relationship for the stability and prosperity of the region. I would like to express my thanks to those who have travelled from both interstate and abroad, particularly, of course, from India, but also other countries, including Singapore and the United States, a truly Indo-Pacific conference. With that, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Minister Jaishankar to open the dialogue. Minister Jaishankar has been India's External Affairs Minister since 2019, and before that he played an instrumental role in Indian foreign policy as Foreign Secretary and numerous ambassadorships, including to the US and China. He is truly a giant of international relations and one of the most influential foreign ministers in the world today. Minister, please do us the pleasure of opening the inaugural Raisina at Sydney.
A very good afternoon to all of you. Justin, Samir, Minister, colleagues and friends. It's really a pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and I think as Justin pointed out, this is an occasion for the Raisina dialogue to step beyond the shores of India. And in the room today, I mean, there could be a few others, but I think Samir and I could claim to be present at the inception of Raisina dialogue. It's a little bit like watching your kid go out of the country and, you know, you have an interest, you have a sense of pride. And really thank you very much for partnering us in this enterprise. And I hope in the coming years that this would become the premier India-Australian forum where we can discuss issues of common interest. Now, we all, you spoke about it as a curtain raiser. So, in a sense, I would like to share with all of you some of the issues which would happen at the beginning of next month in Delhi. Let me first say that at this time it's important we all appreciate that the larger outlook as we see the world is one of great uncertainty, a lot of unpredictability, new players, new behavior. And by the way, I'm talking about the Delhi test between India and Australia. This applies to some degree to the world scenario as well. And if we put together really the cumulative impact of 3 years of COVID, the damage that it has done to the global socio-economic fabric, the year of the Ukraine conflict, the knock-on effects, the fuel, food, fertilizer, trade disruptions, the shortages it has created, the uncertainties it has enhanced. And then take some of the perennial challenges which pre-existed. Climate. Now, climate was a growing concern. I think in the last few years, what we thought the future portended has actually happened to us. So we are witnessing climate events on an increasingly larger, more catastrophic scale. And in fact, today in any global risk assessment, I would say building in a climate calculation is very much a part of that. And there are the other concerns about terrorism, concerns about maritime security. There are also growing concerns about financial sustainability. I think there are more than 70 countries who have or are engaging the IMF in terms of stabilizing their national finances. And unlike in the near past, many of these are not low-income countries. Some of them are middle-income countries. So I think even an optimistic view of the world would be reasonably pessimistic at this point of time. My second point, flowing from that, if there is today really an urgent collective task, it is how to de-risk the global economy. And part of that is, exactly the events that I have referred to, over-dependence on manufacturing, over-dependence on energy, over-dependence on services. So how do we create more reliable and resilient supply chains? In a more digital world, how do we ensure at least the minimal trust and transparency? Because the fact is that we cannot be agnostic about data in the manner in which we were mistakenly agnostic about products. You know, where my data resides, who processes it, what do they do with it, how do they extrapolate it, matters deeply to me. So for us to pretend that all nations are the same, and it's none of our business what happens inside, I think that era is now behind us, and we must not just accept it, we must actually be aware of it and make plans to deal with this. And in fact, Minister Bhavan and I were just discussing, this applies as well to green technologies. You know, we should not end up in a world where our desire to be greener leads us to be more dependent on a few and therefore more insecure. So how do we decentralize? How do we collaborate? How do we diversify? In a sense, how do we democratize the world? Democratize it technologically, democratize it economically. I think this is, I would say, the second point which I would flag for your attention. Now, if I were to pick 3 words to put before you the state of our contemporary world, those 3 words for me would be, number 1, globalization. Because globalization has worked, it's had its problems, it's had its downsides, but it's had actually an enormous impact, both the pluses and minuses, on global society. Globalization actually has helped to create a rebalancing. You spoke, Justin, about our G20 presidency. G20 itself is proof of that rebalancing, that till 2008, the global leadership, such as it was seen as G7. And the fact was that the events of 2008-2009 demonstrated that G7 was too narrow. So I use G20, but I would not stop at G20. I use that as a metaphor to underline the point that if you look today at the production and consumption centers of the world, they are vastly different, certainly from what they were in 1945, but I would say almost every decade it's very useful to actually see a decadal chart of who's up and who's down and how the balances are shifting there. And flowing from that rebalancing today is, and I use the word present continuous here, is actually creating an emerging multipolarity. That there will still, I mean, the United States, to my mind, has been the premier power in the foreseeable future. I still see it as the premier power. And clearly the rise of China, the share of China in global economy, in global technology, in global influence, these are undeniable factors. But the fact is that in the, let us say, let's take this decade, you're clearly going to see many more powers who will have more influence on global debates and global outcomes than they did before. And to my mind, certainly some of them would be sufficiently separated from the rest of the herd to be seen as a pole, and therefore you will have multipolarity. Since Brexit, there's obviously been a very intense global debate about globalization. And President Trump's election sort of intensified that debate, if I can put it that way. But to my mind, you know, it's not an issue of is globalization good or bad. You can't turn it back. It's there for real. It's hardwired into our existence. The issue is really what's the right model of globalization. That is it a model which is fairer, which is fairer within societies, fairer between societies? Is it a model where the benefits exceed the vulnerabilities? Because that is today also a very important downside of globalization. So I think that's, to my mind, actually a key global debate. So one is de-risking the global economy, but the second really is the model, the preferred direction of globalization that a lot of countries want to see. Now, in a changing world, obviously there will be new conversations. Among the conversations we are seeing are those of the importance of values, of beliefs, of ideologies, not just in a very antiseptic way of interests. And there is a whole debate which flows out of that, One debate, of course, is that of democratic countries, pluralistic societies, and those who are not. But there's another debate, and it's a debate within the democratic world, which is really whose democracy, whose values, whose definition, whose norms. Because here too, the transformation of the world, the rebalancing, a lot of it derives from an era of, I would say, a G7 dominance, a very Euro-Atlantic view of what is democracy. Now, the fact, if I can put it somewhat immodestly, the fact that democracy is perceived as a global aspiration is actually because India chose to be a democracy at the time of its independence. And because the first country which was decolonizing, and it happened to be the largest country which was decolonizing, chose a difficult democratic path, and then, despite decades of adversity and limited resources, stuck to that path. And stuck to that path when actually other democracies questioned the viability of that path. That today is very much, I think, at the center of a debate and a conversation that we must have on democracy. That there are practices and beliefs and cultures which are relevant to how democracy is actually executed and improved. My next point, of course, is the welfare of the world. Here again, the fact that the capacities of some countries are not what they used to be is a very relevant factor. I particularly refer here to the United States. For me, the big change in the last decade is not that the US capacities are relatively less than what they used to be. It is that the US is actually getting into a mindset where it's aware of that limitation and is open to working with like-minded partners to address it. And like-minded partners include countries who are not treaty allies. Now, in Australia, it's not a change you will readily realize because you are a treaty ally. For you, working with the United States is not anything new. It's part of your history for the last 80 years. For us, it is. So, and it's, certainly I would emphasize that there have been big changes in our foreign policy, but I would equally stress that there's been a big change in American thinking, that this is not the same United States with which we dealt with in the 60s or 80s or even, frankly, in 2005. That there is an evolution out there, and that evolution today you can see on a whole range of issues. And as a result, we actually today have new strategic concepts, new geopolitical theaters, if you would, new mechanisms, and obviously the most notable of these in terms of on a conceptual level is the Indo-Pacific. At a mechanism level is the Quad. The Quad to me is a very, very, it's an enterprise laden with a lot of significance, because if you look at it, there's that Indo-Pacific space, 4 countries, not geographically contiguous at all, with an enormous amount of sea space and some land space between them, but who have in different ways, overcome their own past outlook to forge something common in response to a perceived global and regional need. And it's an endeavor with which I happen perhaps to be associated more closely than most others. I'm still probably the only witness in office of the first effort in 2007. And I've seen it at various levels, from doing it as a permanent secretary to a foreign minister, and now we're seeing it as a summit level, and Australia will be hosting the summit soon. So it is, to my mind, a development of great consequence. And I would say that not just us, I look at the foreign policy of our other Quad partners as well. I think today it has a salience which very few would have predicted, perhaps even 2 or 3 years ago. So finally, let me end with a few thoughts on our G20 presidency. It's obviously an extraordinary opportunity. It's a great honor. It's a time when you have a certain convening power and an agenda shaping opportunity. But it's also, as I said initially, a particularly difficult juncture of world politics. The way the G20 works, it works as a troika. So the incoming and the outgoing are associated with the current chair. So we had some visibility, perhaps a little more than visibility, some role as well, a supportive role, when our predecessor chair, Indonesia, was holding that responsibility. So we know that last year was a real struggle, that the Ukraine conflict had very strongly polarized the G20. All of us worked very hard to find some kind of common ground on that issue. I believe that we did succeed finally at the Bali summit, and I really think an enormous amount of credit is due to Indonesian patience and creativity in that regard. But today, the rest of the world expects the G20 to address its concerns. Because the rest of the world actually, and the rest of the world is another about 180 countries, that they have real problems, pressing problems, deep concerns. And they think it is for the G20, as the top 20 economies of the world, to show the direction, to come up with answers, to at the very least be cognizant and, if not sympathetic, of their concerns. So our hope is that we are able to steer the G20 in the direction in which it should go, to undertake the responsibilities, the remit with which the G20 was originally tasked, which was economic growth and global development. And we are doing this not as just as a, shall I say, feeling the vibes from the rest of the world. We actually did it as a practical, empirical exercise in the month of January. We actually consulted 123 countries, and consulted means at the level of Prime Minister himself and cabinet ministers. We have a good sense today by asking the world, literally asking the world, saying, here we are with this responsibility. What is it which is uppermost in your mind? What is it which is your most pressing concern? And what can we do about it? So today, I just conclude by saying that I had the pleasure of meeting the Prime Minister this morning, of spending time with my counterpart, Penny Wong, this afternoon. I think from what I can see, the Australian view is very much aligned with the thinking which I have put forward. For me, this relationship is exceptionally important, and I can only underline that by the frequency of my visits. that it is exceptionally important. It would, for us, make a big difference in the G20, in the Quad, bilaterally, and I think regionally as well. You know, I'm coming here after spending 3 days in Fiji, so do bear in mind that the India that I represent today is also an India whose influence and interest and footprint is growing in the world. We feel we can be of utility and support in regions which may not be that proximate to us. So that too has been part of my conversations in Australia. So once again, I would thank both ASPI and ORF for providing me the opportunity to share some thoughts about our relationship, about my visit, but most important, to show you the first trailer about what's going to happen in Raisina Dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. Very much appreciated for taking us through the lens of India and a little snapshot of what's to come in the coming weeks. I think what resonates is that to be able to further our democracy, we have to be willing to debate it. That resonated strongly. I'd like now to introduce the Honourable Chris Bowen, Minister for Climate Change and Energy. After entering Parliament in 2004, the Minister has held a wide range of portfolios, including serving as Treasurer, Minister for Human Services, Minister for Immigration and Minister for Small Business. Both climate change and energy are, of course, increasingly portfolios that play dual domestic and international roles, vital for our global partnerships and a key feature of conflict as we're seeing in Russia's war on Ukraine. So it is a pleasure to ask Minister Bowen to provide his remarks.
Thank you very much. Outside that window, 235 years ago, 11 ships sailed through those magnificent heads. And the lives of a woman called Barangaroo, who we now honour just near here, and her husband, Benelong, who's honoured by the name across the way, changed forever. And the lives of all our First Nations people changed forever on that day, which we must acknowledge as we celebrate their elders past, present and emerging. And of course, later this year, our country will have the opportunity for our most important ever act of reconciliation, recognising our First Peoples in our Constitution and providing them with an enshrined voice to Parliament. And that's an opportunity for Australia to show ourselves and to show the world that modern Australia honours and cherishes our First Peoples, and it's important to our country to partner with them as we work to eradicate disadvantage. Well, thank you, ASPI and ORF for convening this important and inaugural Raisina at Sydney Dialogue. And at the outset, can I acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Jaishankar. Now, Dr. Jaishankar, you are not only the Foreign Minister of an important friend, but you should be acknowledged as one of the most thoughtful and impactful thinkers and thought matters on matters relating to our complicated region. We've heard some of those thoughts today. And your book, The India Way, Strategies for an Uncertain World, is important not just for those of us with a deep interest in India, but all of us with an interest in the role of middle powers in a time of bipolar geopolitical contest. So if you haven't read Dr. Jaishankar's book, I highly recommend it. It's a very good read. And the fact that this is your second visit to Australia in just 6 months, I think, underlines the importance you place on the relationship, which we deeply respect and we deeply acknowledge. The Prime Minister is very much looking forward to his bilateral visit to India in March, and I predict discussions on climate and energy will figure prominently in discussions between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Albanese, which of course I'll very much welcome. Now, this is an excellent year for India to chair the G20 and, from my point of view, importantly also chair the Clean Energy Ministerial, an important partnership of the world's key economies working together to accelerate the global energy transformation. It's a very important meeting. 6,000 delegates usually attend the Clean Energy Ministerial. It'll be a very big meeting. Now, there's some disagreement amongst statisticians about whether India has just become the world's most populous nation or is about to become the world's most populous nation in the next month or so. But either way, India is taking its place at the top of the global population mountain. And the theme of India's G20 presidency, Vasudhaiva Kudumpakam, one Earth, one family, one future, to me is an indication of the importance India is going to place on interconnected sustainability. And of course, there's no more important element to interconnected sustainability than ensuring that we are tackling climate change. And I want to acknowledge the enormous effort that I know India is putting into the meeting of the first Energy Transition Working Group. My officials just returned from India just this last week for planning meetings, and they've reported to me just how much effort, as we would know and expect, G20 Chair India is putting into their role as host. And I'm very much looking forward to attending not only the Clean Energy Ministerial and G20 Energy Ministers meeting in Goa, but also the G20 Environmental Ministers stream in Chennai a little while afterwards. I want to make this point very clearly, as I have directly with Minister Jaishankar earlier. There is no stronger supporter of G20 chairmanship by India than Australia. We will support you in every way possible and in partnership with you in this important role. And I welcome Minister Puri's message at the India Energy Week just last week that India will use the presidency not only to give resonance to the voice of developing and underdeveloped countries, but also, and I quote, highlight the common concerns of energy security, energy justice and sustainable energy transition so that developing countries can gain reliable and clean energy. And of course, we very much welcome that. Because when it comes to the response to the climate crisis and the massive energy transformation, I see Australia and India as key and increasingly important partners. The partnership has already begun. I had the privilege of co-chairing with Minister Bhupender Yadav the climate finance negotiations at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, a critical piece of work, and I'm glad we were able to make some progress, Minister Yadav and I, in chairing those conversations. And Energy Minister R.K. Singh came to Australia just 6 months ago, very shortly after our election. I think he was my first bilateral visitor, and he attended the Sydney Energy Forum, and we also engaged in the first ever Quad Energy Ministers meeting during his presence. And I was impressed by RK's incredible focus and thought leadership on the important matter of improving solar panel efficiency. He's very passionate about it, and it's very critical to ensuring that we take the resources we have and make sure that they are working to maximum capacity. I was very pleased to be able to take RK and give him a tour and to show off the Australian ingenuity at the birthplace of the modern solar panel in Randwick, the University of New South Wales School of Photovoltaic and Renewable Energy, and I know he was impressed. He's raised it with me when I've seen him since in other international meetings. So India's chairmanship of the G20 and hosting the CEM is an important opportunity to take our partnership and, speaking frankly, India's level of climate leadership to new levels. And Fatih Birol made this point just last week on his visit to India. He's, of course, the president of the International Energy Agency, and he said India can help drive the global energy agenda on clean energy transitions and energy security with its focus on addressing technology gaps and ensuring diversified supply chains, scaling up clean fuels for the future and mobilising investment. Now, I'd like to, in the time available to me today, focus on two matters which I think will be very important for the world this year, very important for Australia, very important for India's chairmanship of G20, and important for both our countries. And that's the urgent need for collaboration between all like-minded countries on renewable energy supply chains. The Minister referred to this in his remarks. And secondly, I want to touch briefly on what I regard as the equally urgent need for a greater effort from our multilateral development banks on climate financing. Now, the nexus between the global energy crisis sparked by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the significant and urgent need to scale up renewable energy production and capacity in coming years both serve as an important backdrop for today's discussion and indeed for the meetings that are going to occur this year. But equally, we need more than ever strong and resilient supply chains. And I'll be very frank, we can't swap what has been in some parts of the world an over-reliance on one form of energy, gas from Russia, with an over-concentration on renewable energy supply chains which are geographically concentrated as well. That would be a backward step. Energy security requires supply chain security, and with that means resilient and diverse clean energy supply chains accompanied by a diversity of potential suppliers. Now, I want to make it very clear, and I want to make it simple. In Australia, we want to manufacture more things, more elements in the renewable energy supply chain. More solar panels, more inverters, more transformers, more batteries, all the above. But we also want India doing the same, and we very much welcome India's efforts under Prime Minister Modi to do just that, because we need trusted and reliable trading partners being more active in manufacturing of the energy supply chain, and India is a trusted and reliable trading partner par excellence. It's in all our interest to make this a reality, so we all need to be stepping up. And I know it will feature prominently in the Quad Energy Ministers meetings, discussions we'll be having this year. It featured prominently in our first ever meeting of Quad Energy Ministers last year. I know it will figure in all the discussions, and we will welcome and support sensible discussions about diversification of renewable energy supply chains through the G20. Now, as I've noted, the transformation to becoming a renewable economy around the world is the biggest economic change since the Industrial Revolution. But we're undertaking this transformation more quickly than our forefathers had to do. To have the best chance of holding the world as close as possible to 1.5 degrees of warming, we need to maximise emissions reduction between now and 2030. Now, friends, 2030 might seem like a long way away. It is 83 months away. That is not long. To engineer this massive economic transformation in this short period of time, we are going to need to be all in. Governments of all levels, national, regional and local, that's certainly the case in Australia and I believe the case in India. Civil society, trade unions, industry, all of us coming together on this massive transformation. But importantly also, multilateral development organisations. Multilateral development banks cannot be passengers on this journey. We need them stepping up much more. At COP27 in Egypt, in my national statement, I made the point that our international financial architecture was built for a different time and is in need of modernisation. And I was pleased that the cover decision from Sharm el-Sheikh reflected this and included a reference to multilateral development banks to define a new model fit for purpose of addressing the climate emergency. This reflects the growing calls for change, perhaps best exemplified by the Prime Minister of Barbados and her important Bridgetown initiative. These are important words, but this year we have to see more than words. We need to see action, we need to see progress, and I think countries like Australia and India can play an important role in bringing the passion and the thoughts behind things like the Bridgetown initiative to ensure practical, achievable steps forward in multilateral development bank reform. In particular, while public sector investment is important, it's more impactful if it leverages additional private sector investment. Now, in 2021, every dollar of climate finance created by an MDB generated 25 cents of new private finance. For every $1, they generated 25 cents of private finance. Surely we can do better than that. Surely they can leverage more private sector investment than that. So again, I think countries like Australia and India, with our different perspectives, can work together to develop and promote practical, achievable and verifiable improvements to the way MDBs do their work. Now, I've been impressed. It's important we don't overgeneralise. I've been very impressed by the work of the Asian Development Bank, working across our region on the energy transition. But we have not seen, and we need to be frank, that level of commitment from other multilateral development banks. Now, I note the news this week that the current president of the World Bank will leave his position early. This provides an opportunity to reset the leadership of the bank and ensure the centrality of the climate challenge at the core of their work. Now, of course, neither the G20 nor the COP are decision makers when it comes to MDB governance. That's a matter for their respective boards. But both the G20 and the COP are unparalleled opportunities for like-minded countries to make their views and expectations crystal clear. And we expect MDBs to be stepping up to the task, and we expect to see real action from MDBs to improve on this, the most important matter on the global agenda. So friends, in conclusion, when I first visited India in 1998 as a tourist, I fell in love with the country. I have to be honest with you and say I've been back so many times that I have honestly lost count. I don't know how many times I've been back. It's into double figures, I know that. But when I was first in Goa 25 years ago, while I knew I'd be returning often to India, little did I realise or contemplate or imagine that 25 years later I'd be back in Goa collaborating with the Indian minister on the challenges of our times. We know, that is the Indian and Australian governments, how high the stakes are. We know it, we've lived it. We've both been ravaged by natural disasters in recent times. Last year, India saw extreme weather events across the country during 80% of the year, including the May floods, which caused the loss of life and significant crops. In Australia, 68% of Australians were living in an area covered by a natural disaster declaration in 2022 at some point. 68% of our population at some point covered by a natural disaster declaration, with some of the areas experiencing back-to-back multiple declarations time after time, and some areas hit by bushfires and then floods. So our nations don't just know what will happen if we don't act on climate change. We know that those impacts are here and the lived reality now, and that makes the case for action ever more urgent. Natural disasters are becoming more severe, more frequent, and increasingly less natural. And of course, that's before we even get to the matter of daily heat. Both our countries have a beautiful environment, but rising heat and prolonged heat waves have huge health implications, particularly for our elderly and less well off, who can't afford air conditioning, live in areas where heat waves are being experienced for longer and longer, and that has its biggest impact on our elderly and most vulnerable. So we all have an imperative for action. We have the reason, we have the will, and with the ability to collaborate. And 2023 will be a key year for collaboration between India and Australia, and I look forward to doing much more of that this year. Thank you for your time.
Are we going straight up? Thank you. Thanks, Barney. Thank you, Minister Bowen. Thank you both ministers for those remarks. I know we have a reasonably hard deadline, so we'll get straight into some questions, a couple from me, and then we'll try and get into the audience, if that's okay. Dr. Jaishankar, you mentioned in your remarks that you have just come from Fiji. Mm-hmm. With India's near region considered to be the Indian Ocean countries, can you give us your assessment of the Pacific, what it means to India, and what you see as opportunities for India-Australia collaboration?
Well, if I were to speak about the Pacific broadly, one of the big changes which has happened in India over the last 3 decades is that the bulk of our trade has actually shifted eastwards. It's more than 50% of our trade today is to countries east of India. Obviously, most of them are Pacific countries. And that's, in a way, a huge shift from the earlier colonial era trade patterns and routings which were centered around the western coast and to European and Middle Eastern markets. Specifically where the Pacific Islands are concerned, because I was in Fiji, this is a region where we have some history. I think the first set of Indian immigrants came to Fiji, for example, I think in 1879. There's a large Fijian Indian community there. So one part of our interest is obviously the historical cultural linkages. But in recent years, as our own, we have ourselves globalized in thinking of our interests in global terms. We actually created a forum called Forum for India-Pacific Island Cooperation. We've had 2 meetings. This was done by Prime Minister Modi. It was one of his early initiatives in 2014. We've done 2 meetings. We would have done a third, but for the COVID. We hope to do it this year. We today have development assistance programs in every one of the Pacific Islands. We were providers of vaccines during COVID to about 5 of them, if my memory serves me right, 5 or 6 of them. Certainly to Fiji, I know, but to a number of others as well. So I think what you should expect to see is a greater Indian presence, a greater Indian commitment, because it's not just a political commitment, it's also a sustainability commitment, you know, and in many, you know, there are islands where we are active in health, some of them in, we are getting into education. It's therefore a region and a subject where we hope to consult very closely with Australia and work together in a way in which our convergences are enhanced.
Right. Minister, you clearly see the convergences there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, our government has had much deeper engagement with the Pacific as one of our key, perhaps our key foreign policy initiative since May. But we've also noticed and very much welcome the engagement of like-minded countries in the Pacific and step up. India is one. I've discussed with my friend Jean-Pierre the potential collaboration, for more collaboration between Australia and France on climate financing in the Pacific, for example. Germany's just appointed a new ambassador for the Pacific. So we very much welcome all these steps up from around the world in deeper engagement in the Pacific, and there are key opportunities, I think, for ongoing partnerships of Australia working with countries like India on projects right throughout the Pacific.
Lovely. Before asking if anyone in the audience has a question for the 2 ministers, Dr. Jaishankar, a lot of your commentary was focused on democracy and furthering democracy and different forms of democracy. There are occasional comments that we see on the undermining of democracy in India, most recently in the context of the BBC, and just yesterday at the Munich Security Conference, George Soros spoke on many issues, but specifically on open and closed societies, and called on institutional reform in India. How do you, as Foreign Minister of India, explain this when you're dealing with your Quad ministers in particular, as well as others?
Well, look, I actually made 2 points. One, how the world is changing. It is rebalancing. It is less Euro-Atlantic. I don't think everybody gets that. I think old habits die hard. I mean, very candidly, there are still people in the world who believe that their definition, their preferences, their views must override everything else. So, since you mentioned this specific example, I don't know how familiar people are with what was said at the Munich conference. Essentially, Mr. Soros said India is a democratic country, but he doesn't think the Prime Minister of India is a Democrat. By the way, a few years ago, in the same conference, I was there at that time, he actually accused us of planning to strip millions of Muslims of their citizenship, which of course didn't happen. It was a ridiculous suggestion. But you have to understand what this actually means. I could take a view that the individual in question, Mr. Soros, is a old, rich, opinionated person sitting in New York who still thinks that his views should determine how the entire world works. Now, if I could only stop at old, rich and opinionated, I would put it away. But he is old, rich, opinionated and dangerous, because what happens is when such people and such views and such organizations, they actually invest resources in shaping narratives. You know, I spoke about globalization. Now, what globalization does is it actually creates a lot of the seamlessness of globalization, which creates all the opportunities, also allows, you know, narratives to be shaped, money to come in, you know, foundations to go about their agenda. Now, in this particular case, I mean, it is very clear that he has very strong political preferences. He actually thinks that, I mean, doesn't matter that this is a country of 1.4 billion people, we are almost there, whose voters decide how the country should run. He actually thinks, well, if, you know, and again, I cite him as an extreme example, okay? But there are other, you know, manifestations of this in different countries, where people like him think an election is good if the person we want to see wins. If the election throws up a different outcome, then we actually will say it's a flawed democracy. You know, this to my and the beauty is all this is done under the pretense of advocacy of open society, of transparency, etc. So our generation, we have grown up with concepts like regime change, which influence operations. Now, you can call it what you will. I mean, to me, this really looks the same, with a gloss of some kind of do-goodism on it. So, for me, it's actually necessary today that we have today a serious conversation on democracy. You know, when I look at my own democracy, I mean, I have today a voter turnout which is unprecedented, electoral outcomes which are decisive, electoral processes which are not questioned. We are not one of those countries where after the election somebody goes to arbitrate in court. Okay? We don't have any hanging chads either. And you know, where you actually say, I will sit in judgment over the verdict of voters. Now, my sense of democracy is the voter is supposed to decide. And it worries us because, look, we are a country which went through colonialism. We know the dangers of what happens when there is outside interference in whatever guise in your politics. If you do this kind of scaremongering, like millions of people will be deprived of citizenship, it actually does real damage to our societal fabric, because somebody out there believes you, and you don't leave it to accident, by the way, you back it up with an operation. So you create that kind of fear psychosis, and then you use that to validate your original judgment. So I do think today between, you know, whose democracy, whose globalization, why, you know, the transparency of how global processes work. These are real issues which need to be debated.
Thank you, Ms. Benoit. I was going to ask you a renewable energy question, but with timing, might get one from the audience anyway. If it's okay, I'll got a couple of hands up. I think the Australia-India Business Council had the first question.
Kind of. I represent the Australia-India Chamber of Commerce.
Chamber of Commerce. Apologies.
Thank you. Anyway, also a worthy body. And thank you to both speakers. I have a question for Mr. Bowen. India is, as we know, a rapidly growing and developing nation, and it has great and growing energy needs, and I think currently has about 20 nuclear reactors. Am I right? Something like that. Is there any plans, or can we perhaps foreshadow?
We have 37 nuclear.
37. Okay.
I think so. I mean,
okay. More than I thought.
Yeah.
At one point, Australia did export uranium to India. Is there any thought or any possibility, given that we export to other nations, that exports to uranium could go to India?
Well, there's certainly no impediment in terms of political party decisions once all the necessary arrangements have been made. So I wouldn't have envisaged any change in approach on a change of government on that matter. It's simply just working the issues through. But certainly there's absolutely no, I think, imperative if all the legal requirements under Australian law and Australian international obligations could be met. But I think there are certain treaty obligations which also need to be considered, which we would have to honour and we would have to be satisfied of. And that's a standard requirement across all trading partners. That's not a specific comment in relation to India.
I saw Gordon Flake all the way from Perth for the Raisina at Sydney. Fantastic to have you here, Gordon.
Delighted to make sure that we've got coverage from Australia's Indian Ocean capital. Gordon Flake with the Perth US Asia Centre. A question for Minister Jaishankar. I wonder if I might get your reaction to the comments that Minister Bowen made about the importance of renewable energy supply chains and his focus on India as a trusted and reliable partner par excellence. We had last year both your ministerial colleagues, Minister Joshi, Minister Goyal, visit. In October, the Japanese Prime Minister visited Western Australia with an intense focus on those clean energy supply chains, with the notion that the road to future energy went through Australia. I wonder if you might address and respond to Minister Bowen's comments in terms of how India views Australia when it comes to energy security and future energy.
You know, I'm not an energy guy, but I'm a sort of jack of all trades. So I'll have a shot at the answer. My sense is a lot of countries are re-looking at their energy future. They're re-looking at the energy future for some of the reasons which Minister Bowen spoke about, that there's today a great deal of anxiety on the fossil fuel, on the accessibility, on the affordability, on the volatility of those markets. There's worry when it comes to renewables that, you know, are we excessively dependent on particular geographies? And, you know, there could be disruptions there, but there could be leveraging there, call it what you will, but dependence is dependence. So, to my mind, what happens, and what has happened even in the past, when the world starts getting nervous about a particular set of concerns, there's almost an intuitive sense in the world that let's go out there and look for different solutions, different arrangements, different transactions which will, as I said, de-risk all of us. I think when we, in our case, we are thinking about it very actively. We know we are not the only country which is thinking about it. It's also been a subject of conversation in the Quad, in other formats as well, I would say. And certainly we see Australia as a particularly important partner here because, you know, if the future, we see the future as more renewable, we see the future as more nuclear, we see the future as more green hydrogen, green ammonia. Now, each of these, we see EV will mean the capital letters will become stronger with the passage of time. Oh, many of these roads do lead to Australia. So I do think that the energy side of our relationship, but I wouldn't put it just as energy. I would really put it as a kind of an economic security side of the relationship, really growing in times to come.
Minister Bowen, do you want to respond to any of that? Your line of energy security needs, supply chain security, I think was very important.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can add too much to what I said at the podium, and I do think it is, in many senses, issue 1, 2 and 3 for energy ministers around the world. It would just be, it is just unthinkable for this important transition to be reliant on a geographically specific supply chain as we are. And I think of things which could slow down our transition to renewables. I can think of a few. When I think of things which could stop our transition to renewables, I can really only think of one, and that is the disruption to supply chains for solar panels, batteries, inverters, electrolysers, all the above. I mean, it could stop us, and so we need to diversify as a matter of great urgency.
I think we have one more question before needing to go on to your next meetings. It might require short answers, but please go ahead.
Jasmine Crawford-Hill from the Australia-India Youth Dialogue. We've heard about democratising and diversifying manufacturing and supply chains, but nothing about the beginning of that cycle, about the need to democratise and potentially diversify R&D and who holds IP. And I think we did start to see this through COVID with vaccines and access. What does it look like if we're going to talk about embedding values and culture, not just into our manufacturing and supply chains, but into our research? Then is there a need for us to lead the region in democratising research as well?
To either of us? Well, we already share our R&D with the world, a little bit too much for my liking sometimes. Because the modern solar panel was invented, as I said, in Randwick. Literally the PERC technology, which is in 98% of the world's solar panels, came from the University of New South Wales in collaboration with the Australian National University. But we have exported all the expertise to turning that into manufacturing, and not in a good way, in that we manufacture a small number of solar panels in Australia. 1% of the solar panels we use are made in Australia, but they're all invented in Australia, and almost all the solar panels around the world are in effect a modern Australian invention in the latest technology. Now, there's some good signs arising out of the University of New South Wales is the latest research, which is replacing copper with silver inside the solar panel, which, much to our friend Dr. Jaishankar's ministerial colleague and my friend R.K. Singh's delight, is now the most efficient solar panel in the world and can potentially be scaled up to production, and they are looking to produce it in Australia. So that there are all big steps forward, but I don't think there's any problem with sharing Australian IP. I think it's gone a bit too far the other way.
You know, from an Indian perspective, this is a very valid question because it's been a big source of concern for us when it comes to policy making. A sense that we are underinvested in R&D. And we are. I think a large part of the problem derives from the fact that we are underinvested in manufacturing. So you can't have a strong R&D economy and a weak manufacturing economy. They don't go together. And in previous years, quite honestly, we made life difficult for ourselves when it came to manufacturing through a set of policy decisions which were taken. And a lot of our inabilities and shortcomings were actually rationalized, saying, you know, we are Indians, our real strength is in services, which was a good cop-out of what you failed to do. That is today getting addressed. So if you look at the last few years, there's been a huge push to expand and intensify manufacturing. There's even the HR support. I mean, the emphasis on skills, on vocational education, on innovation, on startups, on patents. This is almost like a new culture which is taking place, and I can see it actually taking root. You know, I visit a lot of educational institutions across India. 10 years ago, if I went somewhere, they would trot out the best 5 students and say, you know, these are the gold medalists of our institution. Today they say, you know, give us half an hour, we want to put a display and we want to introduce you to 5 people who hold patents while they're still studying in the university. That to me is a big mindset shift. I accept that we have a long way to go there. I think the Prime Minister and the government knows that. But it is today a course correction that we have made. I think we have made that very decisively. We now need to really intensify it. We have this initiative called Production Linked Incentive Program, which is designed to actually get countries to come in, collaborate with us. I'm hearing more and more anecdotal evidence of global companies setting R&D up in India. We're trying to make it easier for them. So yes, work in progress, but honestly, a lot of work to be done.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Minister Jaishankar, Minister Bowen, thank you for being the ministers involved with the inaugural Raisina at Sydney, from foreign policy to climate policy to energy security and democracy, and how technology impacts all of them. It has shown the breadth and importance of the Australia-India relationship. So please, let's thank both ministers.
Thank you.
And a small little break as they go before we go into the next panel. Thank you.